CEOs are getting shot down in the streets. Like, after another 4 years of Donald Trump, especially if we get the kind of financial crisis that is a distinct possibility, we're going to see a lot more of that. And if we just had Bernie in there to like try to talk about real issues and try to spin the dial in the right direction a little bit, then like upper middle class a-holes like myself would have been perfectly secure for the rest of our lives.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am Rory, in charge of podcasting, and I am joined as always by Rob, who's in charge of politics. How are you this time?
Oh, not so bad. How you doing, Rory?
I'm lucky to be here. I'm lucky to be recording because there's currently Storm Dara is on its way. So I could cut out at any moment.
Oh, there's this like, you don't have hurricanes in Northern Ireland, do you?
We do get them, but they're generally like, the worst we'll get is like a category 1, which is like 100 miles an hour. So yeah, it's around that. So I think the west coast of Ireland is getting the red warning, while the rest is only getting the amber. So it'll probably be about 60 miles an hour. I'm quite inland, you see, which has its advantages. We have bad views, but means the wind isn't as bad, but it should be some torrential rain and wind tonight. So the power may go out at any moment.
I hope you survive. I hope we finish the recording.
Let's hope so.
Indeed. Indeed.
I seen a good photograph of you in Starbucks.
What?
Yeah, it's all over the news. You're looking pretty happy.
I was in Starbucks.
Yes.
To what
On
end?
your wee bicycle around New York.
Oh, yeah? I'm confused. What are we talking about?
The CEO of a health insurance company.
Ah, yes. So this is coming out about a month later, but I think it's worth talking about and emphasizing something that I assume is going to be mostly forgotten by Christmas Eve, but it is
possibly.
But I think it's actually important, and it is actually where I wanted to open today. Rory, you kind of read my mind.
As always.
I am not somebody who ever endorses political violence. I think it's always a shame, and it's an indicator of something else that's desperately wrong.
Oh, yeah. Failure.
Yes, something else that's desperately wrong. I feel terrible for the family of Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, who was assassinated this week here in New York City. But it is worth paying attention to just how few people care about this. And I'll be honest, I don't personally think that Brian Thompson brought anything good to the world.
It is scaring a very important minority, that is billionaires. I seen Elon Musk basically defending billionaires and CEOs and saying that people shouldn't be happy about this.
Well, I don't think people should be happy about this, but I think it's an indicator of real rage. And I wouldn't be surprised, I don't think it's necessarily likely, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was the start of a trend. Brian Thompson, I don't think he was a billionaire, actually. He was a multi-millionaire, rich beyond the dreams of avarice.
He's not in the 3 comma club.
For all of humanity, for all of human history. You know, this guy was still working for $10 million a year. Billionaires don't need to do that. But it's clear, I did look a little bit into Brian Thompson's career, and while absolutely nobody should die for working a job, and I absolutely would never endorse assassination, this guy was a monster. This guy delivered negative value to humanity at every step of his career and was rewarded for it. The existence of his career is an indication of something desperately wrong in American society that is not going to be corrected. So his big thing, Rory, on his way up the corporate ladder at United Healthcare was Medicare Advantage, which is an incredible scam. There is in the United States, in fact, a worthwhile healthcare program for the elderly. If you're over 65 years old in the United States, you get your healthcare paid for. It is actually a very well-functioning program. You never hear about it.
Because it works, you tend to not do that. The news tends to focus on what goes wrong.
Yeah, you don't hear about government programs that work because that's not how our media works and hasn't been how our media has worked for the past, 40 years, 45 years of the Reagan era. But it's tremendously effective. It gets people their money. Ronald Reagan could not kill Medicare, but what he
Hmm.
did do was he introduced a loophole, essentially saying that Medicare, as an efficiency thing, shouldn't just handle everything itself, but should actually start working with insurance companies and start letting them handle some of this Medicare money. What Brian Thompson, the CEO of UHC, did was exhibit incredible success in getting vulnerable seniors to sign up to give up their Medicare and sign up for Medicare Advantage,
Wow.
which is dramatically worse service that gives tons and tons, gives billions and billions of dollars to private companies. I mean, it's the very definition of just worthless handouts to disgusting corporate greed. It's essentially there is a public Medicare system, there is a public-private Medicare Advantage system that provides worse service, provides fewer things, and charges the government more. So it is exclusively corporate welfare. That's what Brian Thompson did to become the CEO of one of the largest healthcare providers on the planet.
So we don't know who the shooter is yet, but the shell casings had the words deny, defend, depose. Have you seen this?
Yes, so this was very clearly, we can only speculate at this. Well, actually, this is going to be coming out in about 3 weeks, so perhaps we'll know by this point.
Yeah.
But it seems very clear that it is a very intentional political act.
I feel like it's possibly someone who's lost a loved one because of this corporation.
I think it's entirely possible, or it could just be a new iteration, a new, very positive iteration, frankly, of a psychological type that we've become really uncomfortably familiar with in the United States since Columbine at the turn of the century. This could essentially be a school shooter who decided to do some good,
Mhm.
somebody who wanted to go out and kill somebody and actually found somebody worth killing rather than a bunch of school children. And if that's where we're going as a society, I'd much rather, obviously nobody should be dying, nobody should be being assassinated, but truly horrific world destroying CEOs like Brian Thompson, I'm happier seeing them dying than a bunch of school kids. I'd be happier, of course, in a world, Rory, where nobody was dying.
Definitely. But it reminds me of something that Bernie Sanders was saying. He was in an interview with Joe.ie, an Irish slash now British journalistic endeavor. And he was basically saying, like, oh, how many people do you know have gone bankrupt because they had to pay for healthcare? And the interviewer was like, none. And he's like, well, what do you mean? You have to get onto this. This is a thing that'll be happening once you get more American style healthcare. And it just reminds me of a lot of the problems that America is facing that it may not have if it had of went with a certain working class man from the Bronx.
Well, I can assure you, we would have had the same problems, but they would have been so much better. And that gets to what I want to talk about today, which is Bernie would have won. Or maybe if he hadn't have won, he should have won. I think it's
Sorry, he's from Brooklyn, not the Bronx.
yes,
Apologies.
that's I was gonna say those are two very different places. Gosh, I mean, did anybody live in the Bronx? Well, I guess he's not quite that old. The Bronx famously was entirely built up in the 1920s,
Okay.
and it was like farmland before that. And no, Bernie is not quite that old, but he's very old. And
Yes.
he's from Brooklyn. I think he might have gone to the same high school as like Ruth Bader Ginsburg or something. Like New York, the incredible
Well, he
wealth
is
of
83, born in 1941.
yes, he is from Brooklyn. But more broadly, like I am not a socialist or what have you, but I do acknowledge it was actually quite the opposite. I spent my 20s as a libertarian and made it into my 30s as a pretty doctrinaire, hyper capitalist, pro business fundamentalist, deeply in love with Ronald Reagan. But at a certain point, you've got to change your views to acknowledge what's actually happening out there. And I think the fact that healthcare CEOs are now getting gunned down in the streets is a pretty good indicator
Mhm.
of just how badly out of whack the United States is and how we need to go in some different directions. And I would say that Bernie Sanders is the only guy I'm seeing in U.S. politics over the past decade who has offered at a high level that potential path. I think there's a whole genre that I've been swimming in, and I think a lot of other political folks have been swimming in, of what should the Democratic Party do? Should they go more left? Should they go more anti-woke? Should they go this, that, the other thing? And I don't think it'll surprise anybody that I'm probably coming down a little more on the left side of those discussions, but I'm not entirely certain. Maybe Matt Iglesias and Ezra Klein and Rahm Emanuel are right, and actually popularism is important, and there isn't really an appetite for like big time leftism or whatever. But I think there should be.
Well, to put my opinion across, I would feel both American parties are quite right wing. So, like, I think I'm going to use France because I think France is where, right and left wing came from. So if you were to plot both parties in France today, they'd both be considered at least center right to right wing. So the idea but I do feel that Bernie Sanders you could describe him as genuinely left wing, which is a rare thing in American politics.
And I'm definitely nowhere near as left wing as Bernie Sanders is. But the thing about Bernie Sanders being president is that he wouldn't have been able to do anything. We just would have had like 4 to 8 years without a tax cut, and we actually would have spent that time discussing things that mattered. Like, what we need in the United States right now is like a series of incremental changes, like just knob spins or what have you. And what we've been doing with Donald Trump for the past 8 years, is now going to be 12 years, has been an exercise in actually turning the knobs in the wrong direction. If we'd had Bernie as the president, he wouldn't have been able to do any of the things that he promised, but we would have spent that time actually discussing real issues, like the issue that ended up with this healthcare CEO getting gunned down in the streets. Like real issues like how much housing costs, real issues like how much education costs. We would have discussed them. We wouldn't have done anything that Bernie wanted to do, but we would have made just little knob shifts that actually could have kept Brian Thompson alive, for sure.
But do you think he would have got something done? Like, I'm sure he would have got some things passed. Obviously, not everything that he would want, but
Oh, I don't think he would have gotten much done at all.
wow.
No.
Well, why is that particularly?
Well, it depends on when he would have gotten elected. I think that if he'd gotten elected in 2016, nothing. He wouldn't have done a thing, because he would have had a Congress full of Republicans and Democrats that was all about freaking out because he's a socialist. That would have been all that would have happened. If he'd come to power in 2020, actually, I think things could have been very different. So I don't want to do another entry in the what should the Democratic Party do? I'm not a Democrat. We'll see. I'm interested to see what they come up with. What I am kind of interested in doing is like a little bit of like science fiction, Rory. Like what would have happened if Bernie had gotten elected in 2016? What would have happened if he'd gotten elected in 2020? I think the 2016 is probably a much briefer question. But to preface this, before this, I like my diagnosis of what's wrong with the United States is that we have elites in both parties, outside of the parties, the large class of wealthy people that own both parties, that made some incredibly bad decisions. We had the Iraq War, just sort of out of control foreign policy freaks who've really just ruled the roost for the past 20, 25 years, and insane pro-business fundamentalists who brought us the 2008 financial crisis. And 16 years after the 2008 financial crisis, 21 years after the Iraq War, or at least 18 years after the Iraq War was obviously an unredeemable, horrific failure, we had a U.S. presidential election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump where the national security freaks and the pro-business fundamentalists were going to win no matter who got elected.
Yeah.
And they won. There was no real election in 2024 if you were interested in somebody who was legitimately going to challenge the morons that screwed up U.S. empire over the past 2 decades. There was no choice in 2024. There just wasn't. In 2016, at least in the Democratic primary, and in 2020 in the Democratic primary, there was, as you said, a very cantankerous gentleman from Brooklyn who was actually going to provide a challenge, was actually going to provide real discussions. I have zero faith that Donald Trump is going to upend anything. Like the extraordinary, like look at what Donald Trump has like supposedly changed and made this like huge difference. Like the main things that Donald Trump is credited with are more aggression towards China. Like
Yeah. And it seems to be tariffs.
exactly what the national security freaks want. And then the tariffs, which is like obviously like does go against like pro-business fundamentalism a little bit, but it's actually coming along at just the point where all the like pro-business fundamentalists in the United States are beginning to feel competition from China. So it's just
Yeah.
like it's what they want anyway.
Yeah.
That's the big disruption that Donald Trump has offered. So I guess let's go back to 2016.
Well, it's
Is that-
also the fact just the amount of like experience Bernie Sanders has. Like he was in was it the longest standing independence party in America?
Well, I don't think there is an independent party. I think it's just Bernie Sanders is an independent.
Okay.
Yeah.
But was he not in a small party for a while that eventually had to sort of admit defeat in like the 80s? The party I was referring to was the Liberty Union Party. Sanders ran as a Liberty Union candidate in several elections during the early 70s. He left the party in 1977, citing dissatisfaction with its lack of activity and strategic direction. Subsequently began his political career as an independent.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not aware. I'm not aware of that part of his history. I only became aware of Bernie Sanders when I think he was in the House of Representatives for a decade or decades. And then he's been in the Senate. I think since the 2000s he was in the Senate. So I'll confess, I don't know his party history, but I know.
But like he was there when Martin Luther King did his "We Have a Dream" speech. Like he's had quite an incredible life. He's been a carpenter. He has been a proper working class background. They were saying like, they were never short on food, but anything else was not guaranteed.
What Bernie Sanders has that I don't think comparably aged gentlemen in U.S. politics like Donald Trump and Joe Biden certainly don't have, was Bernie Sanders there's actually photographs of a young Bernie Sanders getting arrested at civil rights marches in the 1960s.
And I think he was also campaigning for like, I think student dorms weren't mixed back then, weren't mixed race, and he was protesting that, and then it got through and they were allowed to be, like he's a man that seems to always be on the right side of history.
Well, yeah, he's been very consistent, and he's been very clear about what he wants and what he's about. I think he describes himself as a democratic socialist. He is not,
like a Norwegian style, Nordic socialism.
And yeah, I don't think I don't think he would have been like an uproariously successful politician or president, but I think he would have been an opportunity to talk about something that matters. And we have done very little of that. I do think Joe Biden did a few things that were very worthwhile, and the clock is going to get turned back on all of that.
Yeah.
All of that. Like it's just...
I only recently heard a definition of culture war, because it's something I kept hearing, thrown out, and someone was like, oh, it's talking about economics without talking about economics. And I feel like Bernie Sanders would talk about economics by talking about economics.
Yes, I think that's a very good formulation. It's just amazing how much better that would be. In 2015, in 2016, I was certainly never a supporter of Hillary Clinton, but I was not a supporter of Bernie Sanders either. I thought it was just honestly hilarious. What I was trying to do I was still pretty hyper-capitalistic, still pretty much a pro-business fundamentalist in 2015, but my big priority was we desperately needed a shakeup, so I thought we should all vote for third-party candidates. That was my goal in 2015 before the emergence of Trump. We needed to vote for third-party candidates not because a third-party candidate was going to be a president, but because if you look at how Ross Perot had performed in the 1990s, was a very successful third-party candidate. I can't recall what he got at his height. Maybe, I don't think he made it as much as 10%, or did he, of the popular vote? But taking that significant a slice was a wake-up call to both the Republican and Democratic parties to reformulate. And his agenda was sort of run off with. So I thought we should all vote for third-party candidates
Mm-hmm.
to make the parties pay attention, essentially. That was my hope. That was my approach. But then, like, what I was surprised and did not expect is that both the Republican and Democratic parties had insurgents in their own party process. So I was correct that it was time to shake things up, but I didn't realize that both the Republicans and Democrats would have that within their primaries. Bernie Sanders started just shocking the world in doing much, much better against Hillary Clinton than anybody had expected. Hillary Clinton in 2016 was essentially being coronated, or at least that was the
Oh yeah,
plan.
yeah.
She was supposed to have coronation as the Democratic nominee. I think there was it Lincoln Steffens? Is that a name? There was some
Mm.
other like no hope, nobody person attempting to run against her, and Bernie Sanders, who probably initially she thought it was funny
Yeah.
that he was running against her, thought that he'd be a really useful. I do wonder about how. I mean, I think they had multiple debates, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, and I think she initially entertained that because she was like, "Aha, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to look less left wing. I want to look. This is a perfect opportunity.
Respectable and pro
Yeah,
business.
Bernie Sanders is perfect for me." I feel like she did this twice in 2016, actually. My opponent is perfect for me because nobody could possibly choose them over me. And unfortunately, she was wrong both times. I think she wanted Bernie Sanders to be this crazy socialist clown that she could say, well, no, I'm serious and I talk to the banks and I, know what the business community wants. Like that's what she wanted. And I think she and the people around her were probably pretty shocked to realize that that was not what the Democratic Party base wanted. And to be clear, I think with much stronger and more correct arguments, you can argue that Hillary Clinton won in the Democratic primary process fair and square in 2016. I mean, she had decades of experience. Hillary supporters do point out, and I think it was for no good reason, but she was actually well regarded. I mean, I remember the memes about Hillary Clinton, usually related to her destruction of Libya,
Wow.
her failed, but about how on top of it she was. Those pictures of her in sunglasses on a military thing, looking at her phone, like getting things done. This was the profile that the media gave to her. But so yeah, like I think she did beat Bernie fair and square. You can talk about super delegates. You can talk about there are infinite controversies as to how Hillary beat Bernie in 2016, and but I think largely, yeah, like it was an incredible insurgent out of nowhere campaign that did vastly better than anybody expect. I didn't know who Bernie Sanders was
Yeah.
before 2016, and I've consider myself reasonably politically aware. And yeah, it's not surprising actually that he did not win. But then of course Hillary Clinton, managed to then limp on into the general election where she lost to Donald Trump. It's just this is like the clear message that the US electorate is sending for a lot of really clear reasons. Like the reason that that ended the life of this healthcare executive this week. Like there are absolutely, you can find plenty of people in the United States that are perfectly happy and perfectly fine with how things are going. And yes, the Democratic Party is picking up a lot more of those educated, highly paid suburban people. But that is not the majority of this country.
But do you not think that the lives that those two people have lived is exactly what's wrong with the Democratic Party? Like Hillary Clinton, someone that's like was born into wealth and was given the best. And is it a legal background she had before moving into politics?
Was she born into wealth? I know Clinton wasn't, and I mean Hillary. I don't know that Hillary. I mean, I don't know much about Hillary Clinton's background. I'll be honest. I don't know that she was dramatically more affluent than Bernie Sanders was, but perhaps she was.
Okay, oh, I'm just saying that it's, Bernie came from very little. He was very involved in workers' rights. Was it the mayor of Vermont for a while?
He was
Burlington,
a mayor.
Vermont for a long time?
Yes, he
Like
was
he
a mayor
seems
in
like he
Vermont for a
slowly
while.
worked himself up. And it felt like that's what the Democratic Party used to represent was people like Bernie, ordinary working class people, and now it's more Hillary Clinton types.
I
I
feel the need to push back on that a little
okay.
bit. What Bernie was he was a man who came from an older and I think Hillary Clinton to a degree as well, an older United States that had real social mobility.
Hmm.
Like and this is, I think, why Biden did have a real appeal over a lot of the sort of Gen X, Kamala Harris type folks in the 2020 primaries. But a pale shadow of the appeal that Bernie Sanders had is that both of those men remember an older version of America, an older version of politics where union power was respected, where there was real social mobility. And like Bernie Sanders, I think, didn't, was certainly not wealthy growing up, but I was talking about just like these institutions of mid-century, New York specifically, actually, just the number of folks who came from hardscrabble immigrant backgrounds and then were able to like go to the City University of New York and end up at NASA and end up at like, and like Bernie Sanders is sort of like,
That generation.
is emblematic of an older America. But like, I don't really see Bernie Sanders as like an impoverished man of the people. Like Vermont is certainly left leaning, but like it is, and I'm sure there are working class people in Vermont that Bernie Sanders has done a good job of representing as mayor, as representative, as senator. But it's also, I like my stereotype of Vermont and a lot of the progressive people who were voting for Bernie Sanders over the course of his career is that it's a playground for rich people.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
like, I just want to push back a little bit on like, the Bernie Sanders like class warrior guy. I think he absolutely represents something really real, but I think overemphasizing the blue collarness of his biography is perhaps. I mean, he does own multiple houses. He is.
Oh yeah, now he does.
Yes, he is, and he's had an amazing life actually, and I don't think working class hero is actually the terminology that even he would feel comfortable having applied to him. So I just want to push back on that a little bit.
Okay.
But he was an insurgent, and I just think so often how much better it would have been if the insurgent Democrat had won rather than the insurgent Republican. And there's no question in my mind that there was real appetite for what Bernie was selling and real institutional pathways that were just desperate for him to show up and reinvigorate. Kamala Harris lost the endorsements, and I think Biden as well, but more Kamala lost the endorsements of some pretty big ticket unions. Bernie Sanders was not going to lose the endorsement
Oh
of a
no, no,
single union.
he might pick up a
Like,
couple.
yeah. And there's just so much that like it's, I think, oversold, but because it's coming from such a low base, but there has been a resurgence of union power in the United States. And if like Bernie was there to actually help some of that stuff coalesce and move forward, like I think we'd have been a country that didn't celebrate it when healthcare CEOs get murdered. I keep coming back to this UHC CEO, and it's like my instincts are not like left wing. I grew up pretty comfortable and would like to live out the rest of my life pretty comfortably in a capitalist society. But I think we are at a point where it's time to recalibrate. It's
Well,
time
it
to.
does feel very like Rockefeller eras. You do have these people that have industries that were able to just gobble up everything else that was a competition, with mostly the ones from Silicon Valley, and they just can't be, you can't compete against them because they just, well, I'm always reminded of is, do you remember diapers.com?
Hmm.
There was
Hmm.
a website that sold diapers, which are nappies, and it was called diapers.com. And Amazon basically, they said they would sell nappies for free if it was like either we will destroy this company or buy you up. And that's basically what they do. And that's why they kind of rule everything. They've all picked out their patches. Occasionally they fight over the odd new bit of technology, but they're very entrenched now.
Yeah, and and I think that's a really good point. Like, had we both parties, even Donald Trump, are now realizing, oh God, like we should probably do something about big tech. And actually, Trump very half-heartedly did start some processes against big tech, cases from the Department of Justice, what have you. Biden didn't stop, and they are progressing. But like, Just think how much between 2016 and 2024, how much more of the U.S. economy big tech has swallowed up, and how little of that is going to change over the course of the Trump administration. It's just a waste of time. Is sort of what
And
it's been.
Trump's never recorded a folk album called We Shall Overcome.
There's that too. Bernie Sanders is a recording artist.
Yes.
I did not realize that. I did not
1987.
realize that.
The banks are made of marble with a guard at every door, and the vaults are stuffed with silver that the workers sweated for.
Instead of Donald Trump.
Well, I get the feeling the news would have been boring, but kind of like how news might have been in the 60s where they kind of talk about policies.
Things that actually mattered, like this
Yes.
the utter nonsense, the deranged fantasies of MSNBC about Russia, and this idea that somehow there was going to be a magical court case that was going to change everything, and put Hillary Clinton back in power. Like, who
Yeah.
cares? Like, it was just this incredible freak out. Like Donald Trump winning in 2016 might have been worthwhile as a wake-up call, but it seems like every Democrat did everything they possibly could to avoid waking up. Where if it's Russia, it's racists, it's this, that, no, like, it's not just desperate attempts to avoid the fact that healthcare was too expensive, education was too expensive, and housing was too expensive. Like, these little basics that Bernie Sanders would have been talking about from day one. And that's what we would have talked about in these very boring newscasts.
You were talking about that he'd be able to adjust knobs ever so slightly. What do you think he would have been able to achieve?
I mean, there's some things that Biden has started in 2020. You were speaking about monopoly earlier. We've sung the praises of Lena Khan a number of times at the FTC, finally starting to take competition law, or antitrust as we call it in the United States, seriously again. Basic, allowing Medicare to negotiate prices, doing away with Medicare Advantage entirely, which I think we had discussed earlier in this podcast. Raising taxes by 5%. Not cutting taxes, just not cutting taxes for a 4 to 8 year period would have been dramatically better for the finances and the sustainability of the U.S. government, U.S. empire, U.S. dollar system. Not essentially acknowledge, and this is the fundamental, one of, if not the fundamental problem of the Democratic Party from 2016 up until today, is not blaming our problems on foreign countries. There's this incredible industry from MSNBC to The Atlantic to, it's been revealed, there was the Bob Woodward of Woodward and Bernstein, the Watergate people.
Okay.
Has spent every year since every 2 years since the 1970s, he's had incredible access to every presidential administration and has written these books that are sort of like a history of the United States as it happens. And he points out that the Biden administration really saw itself as at war with Russia on every level, internationally and domestically, because Trump was just Russia. This delusional assumption that it was a foreign attack. It wasn't what it actually is, which is legitimate problems with the United States. And Bernie Sanders just talking about and acknowledging that it's legitimate problems with the United States. It's interesting because I was thinking about this, I'm afraid that Joe Biden is going to be, by exactly the kind of morons who came up with the Russia hoax in the first place, is going to be lauded as a hero before too long. I think that,
for standing up to Russia or defeating it, or?
Yeah, for essentially defeating Russia. I mean, look at the Ukraine thing is incredibly damaging to Russia. I know that it's not working out to the place. Russia hasn't disintegrated yet or whatever, the way Ann Applebaum and The Atlantic were hoping. But it's been dealt an incredible blow, and the axis of resistance, Iran's whole axis of resistance, seems to be destroyed just in time for Joe Biden to finish his term, and Russia is going to get pushed out of Syria. I mean, these are Like, these are huge. If you believe that the problem with U.S. politics is the power of outside actors like Russia and Iran, well, Biden's done amazingly well. So by his own metrics, he's done amazingly well, and it means abso-effing-lutely nothing to the
Well, the
problems.
price of groceries are high because of Iran, isn't
Well,
that
I
right?
mean, they're in part because we chose to go to war with Russia. But
But I feel like the one country that can blame other countries the least is America.
Exactly. But that's the thing is like Joe Biden, like according to his foreign policy or like his ideas, what he set out, like he's done everything that, was supposed to be great. He's beaten up all our enemies. And it's meaningless. And his successor was essentially laughed out of presidential contention. Kamala Harris, it was not a landslide that Donald Trump won by, but it's Donald Trump beat Kamala Harris. Like Donald Trump won the popular vote. Like I can't think of a more complete delegitimation or trashing
Yeah.
of the Democratic Party than you lost to Donald Trump twice.
Yeah.
That was supposed to be the big wake-up call. That was supposed to be the big wake-up call in 2016. And the choice was, let's go with the ancient Cold Warrior.
But do you know who wasn't too scared to go on Joe Rogan's podcast?
Bernie Sanders. Yes.
But that's when it wasn't mainstream. Apparently, you didn't need to worry about it then. It was just a wee small thing nobody cared about. And this year was completely different.
Yeah. No, it is the levels of just sort of malpractice in the 2024 campaign.
But also, I think the elephant in the room we haven't really mentioned is I keep hearing that Pod Save America apparently is very close to the Democrat Party. And they were doing a thing like, oh, what did we do wrong? Blah, blah. Basically, everything was perfect, and they never mentioned Palestine or Israel once. And I feel a certain gentleman whose father was from Poland would have stood up to Israel a lot more, and things may have been very different.
Yeah, I mean, that is very true. If Bernie Sanders had been president in 2016, the Iran nuclear deal would never have gone away. There never would have been any abortion under the name of the Abraham Accords. And, would Bernie Sanders have solved Israel-Palestine? Absolutely not. Would he have made an incredible show of humiliating and embarrassing the Palestinians at every stage and making sure they felt as marginalized as possible, desperate enough to do an October 7th? Absolutely not. Bernie would have occasionally said the right things about Israel-Palestine. I think we'd probably be in I think Iran would have been giving a lot less money to Hamas and Hezbollah because they would have been focused on their own economy and their participation.
Which would have been doing pretty well.
Yeah. It's just so many pointless missed opportunities. And that's the most frustrating thing is that like foreign policy nut jobs are what put us into this situation. They're what undermined the credibility of U.S. government enough for Donald Trump to get elected. And they're still running the show. They ran and ruined the Biden administration. And despite all of these promises throughout October and November, almost all of Donald Trump's appointments are the same sorts of people who got us into Iraq, who killed millions in the Middle East. Like, it's very frustrating. And it just would have been so much better. I don't think Bernie Sanders would have armed Ukraine or would have cared much about NATO, frankly. I think Bernie Sanders would have...
Would he just have left it on like autopilot, like taking
I'd
over?
I'd assume so. And he'd pretty probably would have been like, well, obviously we're not going to let Ukraine in. I think he would have allowed Russia and Ukraine to actually peacefully resolve their differences, or at least stay in their kind of crappy status quo, rather than accelerate the sanctions because the whole acceleration, you can question whether or not, Donald Trump is responsible for all the sanctioning we did when he was president, all of the arming of Ukraine we did as president. You can make this argument that, oh, no, the Congress forced him to do that. But the reason the Congress forced him to do that is because they thought Russia had made Donald Trump president. Bernie Sanders, like they're just Russia. Nobody would talk about Russia from 2016 to 2020. It just wouldn't have been a focus. And it is the fact that the main cable news stations in the United States went to war against Russia in 2016. I think that has a lot to do with why Russia actually went to war in 2022. And if Bernie had been president in 2016, that is just a whole dynamic that would not have existed.
And also, he would have taken the climate incredibly serious. It's something that he's always been passionate about, and that would have just been stepped into hyper gear. I think it would have been even much bigger than what the IRA that we've seen.
Yeah, it would have been something that we'd actually, again, I don't think he would have, if he'd been elected in 2016, I don't think he would have been able to do anything, but it would have been something we would have talked about. There would have been no tax cuts. The thing is, if Bernie Sanders had been president in 2016, it's entirely possible, like, we never would have made it out of the post-2008 sort of jobless recovery thing, because nobody would have let Bernie Sanders spend any money. That would have been actually pretty disastrous during COVID, but we'd have like a much closer to balanced budget. We'd have a much smaller deficit.
Well, you also would have had a man that would have taken a pandemic seriously.
Well, that's the thing. We would have had a president who was concerned about COVID and interested in working on it. And this works from both ideological valences, like from the sort of Democratic, like, oh my God, I can't believe we basically didn't have a president from January until May when Operation Warp Speed came in. Like Bernie believes in government. Bernie believes in the CDC. He would have followed the notebook set up, oddly enough, by like George W. Bush. He would have followed the protocols, and entirely possible that we would have had a much smaller COVID crisis everywhere in the world, because it is the United States that was the super spreader of all super spreaders, which is something that we never talk about. But also, like, once the vaccines came on stream, once like all of that like had happened, like it wouldn't have been like a badge of partisan pride to be psychotic about masking and lockdowns. So I have.
Oh yeah, it would have just been considered fairly normal.
Well, no, but it also wouldn't, like, you wouldn't have, I mean, you still have people in this city today who are like, fanatically masking everywhere and like won't go out as much anymore. And I think it is true that by 2021, we shouldn't have been doing lockdowns and stuff anymore. But that became like a political totem. It is insane that I think it is more generally acknowledged to be insane that Republicans became like anti-mask and anti this, that, and the other thing. But it's also pretty nuts that like in blue cities, like some schools like weren't open, for normal activity in like 2021. Like that's also pretty nuts. Like it just wouldn't have been, without Donald Trump, if Bernie Sanders had been president, it wouldn't have been this insane, like deranged political issue. Because probably by 2020, like Bernie Sanders would have been this like completely powerless guy who all he really could do, because I assume his entire legislative agenda would have been completely dead in the water, but we wouldn't have been doing war stuff, and we wouldn't have been doing, like, he just would have been about good execution of government. And that's what COVID is like a dramatically better COVID result could have just been good execution of government.
Are you annoyed that the Democratic Party has essentially what it needed to do built in? Like you have an elderly white man who's not going to spook anyone. He could have ran. He could have said, "Oh, I'll make things better." Young people liked him. Old people seem to like him. It's like you had this thing that was perfect. You could have just let him do his thing for a couple of years, move it in the right direction, then take power over. But instead, it's like, no, we have to do it our way or no way. We'll happily lose 3 times in a row as long as it's our way. We can't have this man helping working class people.
It's incredibly frustrating, and it's also incredibly stupid. Like I get it. Like I am like, I mean, I'm well out of it now, but I am kind of, professional management class or whatever. Like I went to law school. I, have gotten big paychecks. By kneecapping Bernie didn't help my long-term interests. Like CEOs are getting shot down in the streets. Like after another 4 years of Donald Trump, especially if we get the kind of financial crisis that is a distinct possibility, we're going to see a lot more of that. And if we just had Bernie in there to like try to talk about real issues and try to spin the dial in the right direction a little bit, then like, upper middle class a-holes like myself would have been perfectly secure for the rest of our lives. Instead, we're going to do 12 years of Donald Trump effery. I guess if everything goes okay and like nothing spins out too well, like we'll have another opportunity to maybe move in a better direction in like 2028. But I'd say it's more likely that like our luck runs out and like the next COVID crisis isn't a COVID crisis that kills 1% of the population. It's a bird flu crisis that kills 25%. Or it's like actually like we stop being incredibly lucky and Russia does nuke something, or, we nuke Shanghai or something. Like there's so many things that could have gotten marginally better to the point where like things could have like continued. Like FDR is like, traitor to his class or whatever. But like FDR is the guy who founded 20th century American capitalism. Like he's the guy who like
kept the show on the road.
Tweaked the knobs enough so that things kept on working. And yeah, we're getting vigilante justice against CEOs, and
You don't want to see it.
That's not actually in the interests of rich suburbanites.
Well, it's good for security firms.
It's great for security firms, but like just a little bit of medicine could have made, because it's just it costs so little freaking money to dramatically improve the outcomes for the vast majority of the American people and make it a lot less likely that CEOs get to come down on the streets.
Could you have seen Bernie doing a lot for healthcare? Because it's something that he does seem to come back to time and time again. Like he's just sort of appalled at how America does healthcare. Could you see him actually being able to change much?
You see, now so in 2016, if he had been the fluke guy who got into power, I don't think he would have been able to do anything. I think that it may even be in a perfect world that like Donald Trump wins in 2016, and instead of doing this absurd Russia BS, like the Democrats are like, oh, let's learn a lesson, and like that actually would have been like the best thing. And in 2020, in the primary process in 2019 and 2020, we had an opportunity to learn that lesson. And I think we discussed this before, but essentially, after Bernie did really well in Iowa, every other Democratic candidate. So Iowa's like the start of the primary process traditionally. Right after that, every other corporate Democrat dropped out and endorsed Biden.
Oh yeah, so he was definitely sabotaged the second time.
Absolutely. 2016, like
Arguable.
Clinton was probably going to win anyway. Like that was the most likely result, obviously. 2020, Bernie was outright sabotaged to save us from Bernie Sanders' socialism.
And a lot would argue it's not really socialism, and he probably wouldn't have been able to implement most of it.
You know who I bet was really excited about Bernie Sanders losing that Democratic primary and probably donated a lot of money for it?
I do not know.
Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare.
Oh, yes, definitely.
So he kind of wrote his own death warrant there, didn't he?
I'm sure a lot of people are, happy that he didn't win.
So the key thing about 2020 is that Joe Biden, like establishment boring Joe Biden,
they're really gonna make me vote for Joe Biden.
He barely won in 2020. Everybody was expecting a Democratic landslide. Like Bernie Sanders would have run against Donald Trump and been like, this guy did nothing, I'm gonna do this.
And he is incredible at debating. And he does have I will refer to again as a rock star ability. Like no one else can be like him. I know obviously comedians can be like him, but no one in politics can sort of act like him. And he does seem to have he just lives to try to help and change people, which is something I think a lot of people would have found earnest about him.
Yeah. Bernie Sanders would have run on Medicare for all. He absolutely would not have gotten that. But he would have gotten something, I think, if he'd been elected in 2020. And he would have, he's actually somebody who respects government and has a sense of what government does. And he would be a good administrator. And he would appoint like competent left-wing people who would.
And it would be incredibly boring. And no one would want to watch it on TV.
True enough.
Yes, but that's what you kind of want. I know it's sort of like a parody that you want boring administrators, but it's hard to be more or less incompetent but exciting as Trump.
Yeah. But like things would have been better.
Could you have seen it moving the orbiting window, as in the Republicans would then have to be, less pro-billionaire?
Bernie already did that. J.D. Vance is absolutely the cat's paw of billionaires. He absolutely has terrible attitudes around women's health. But like, at least in his public facing statements, and, he absolutely, he talks about how he likes Lena Khan. He talks about how he made a big stink about the train deal rim in Ohio. Like, he actually talks. And there are other young Republicans who talk about trying to grow beyond pro-business fundamentalism. So that is the Overton window shifting. There are absolutely very interesting debates about how seriously any of that is. So, I mean, I guess on some level, to try and end it on a positive sense is like Bernie kind of did win, like Bernie absolutely has pushed our politics he's pushed my politics in that direction. Like he has made me aware that actually there is more to life and politics than pro-business fundamentalism. Is inspired me to go back and read the history and be like, oh, well, wait a second. Actually, the reason why there's been all this success and money made with creative destruction in the U.S. sociopolitical system is because a whole bunch of well-meaning big government types spent 100 years building up this edifice. If it wasn't there, and it is falling away, then so Bernie certainly changed my politics. I think he changed the politics of a lot of people.
Could you see him having a very long legacy on American politics? People talking about him in 10 to 20 years and talking about this is something that America should have focused on and encouraging a lot more potential presidents to come?
I hope so. And potentially. Yeah, it almost, he might, I wonder if the fact that he never actually got to run will help or hurt his historical legacy. Because McGovern, who kept being brought up, George McGovern was a famously rabidly left-wing guy who ran against Nixon in 1972 and got his absolutely destroyed.
Yeah, it was one of the worst defeats in American history.
It was pretty bad. Bernie, because it'll always be a question, Bernieism was never actually given the opportunity to be tried. So maybe that'll, but just the fact that he never actually was a major party candidate, maybe people are like, wait, why am I learning about this guy, Bernie Sanders? So I don't know. I mean, who's to say? I think I'll certainly remember who Bernie Sanders was for the rest of my life. As far as his larger historic impact, I don't know. That's really interesting to think about, though. What do you think?
I definitely think so, because I've been seeing a lot of stuff. Have you heard the term domestic capitalism?
I've not heard of that.
There's a whole worry that China was buying up a lot of American bonds to deliberately keep its price deflated. But this whole scheme might be slowly falling apart, so there will be a lot more, because it's basically saying the EU invests huge amounts into America every year, and it might be a bit like, why don't we just start to invest in ourselves instead of being more globalist, being more nationalist? So if that does come to fruition in the next 10 years, it might be time for America to change tack completely. So with that in mind, they might see Bernie's ideas as what might be needed.
I mean, who's to say? I mean, you could say that Bernie, the actual political story is that Bernie had a lot of influence in the Biden administration because he was such a good soldier in 2020 after he was, I would say, ripped off. He was given a fairly large voice in the Democratic administration. The geopolitical angle of that I haven't really thought too much of, which is, kind of despite all my engagement of what happens in other countries, I don't actually think that the outside countries are yet as influential in the United States as they will be eventually.
But not when this is aired. So this will be our Christmas special episode.
I know. Yeah, Bernie would have won. There you go.
Bernie would have won. Christmas Eve it goes out. So Merry Christmas.
And to be positive, it's like maybe Bernie did win. I think that's sort of a good place to end.
He's planted seeds for the future.
Indeed. Merry Christmas, everybody.
Merry Christmas. Ciao, ciao. We'll catch you next time.
Indeed.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.